Good morning. Welcome to our Mother's Day lesson, even though it's not really about mothers, but welcome to you. And if you are a mother, I'm glad you are. It is a blessing. Our title of our lesson today is Denied. Some of the most haunting words that Jesus uttered were about denying him. He taught his disciples that whoever denied him before men, he would deny them before God the Father. With Jesus being our intercessor before the throne of God, these words are hard to forget. It is no surprise then that denying Jesus leads to sorrow and guilt. As Jesus faced the cross, Peter experienced the pain of denying Jesus. From Peter, we learn about the heartbreak of denying Christ and the hope of forgiveness after he did that. Reflect on a time that somebody that you thought a lot of abandoned you. Maybe it was a good friend, maybe it was a relative. How did you feel? Think about that as we go through our lesson, because that is the way that Jesus felt when he was denied by Peter. Okay, our text today, if you want to go ahead and be looking that up, is Luke 22:54 through 62. Luke 22. And I will start off by giving you some background information. The willingness of Jesus to face the cross stands in contrast to the weakness of his disciples. Most notably was Simon Peter, who betrayed Jesus 3 times on the night of his arrest. Peter was one of Jesus' first followers, and he became a pillar in the church. He not only followed Jesus, but he was sort of the head of the 12. It was Peter who first confessed Jesus as Christ, the Son of God. Peter was also part of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, along with James and John. Those 3 were probably Jesus' favorites. It was Peter and John who were given the task of preparing the final Passover meal before his crucifixion. At one point, Peter boasted he would never forsake Jesus, even if everyone else did. In the hours that followed, we find him denying Jesus 3 times. Fear of the implications of being associated with him cracked the rock, as Peter was often called. Though Peter was unfaithful, the resurrected Jesus forgave him, restored him, and recommissioned him for his task in life. In the book of Acts, Peter is seen as a leader in the church, and he is one responsible for expanding the gospel to many, many areas of the country. Despite Peter's faithlessness, God still used him in a mighty way in his kingdom. Peter may have denied Christ, but the power of God's grace, but through it, he persevered. Like us, Peter was a great sinner, but Christ is even greater. Okay, let's look at our first verse, and it is, our verse is 54 through 55. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat with them. Now the darkness of the evening was not as sinister as the hearts of the mob that seized Jesus and led him away. The words seized and led away show us that the guards used force, even though Christ did not struggle and he did not resist. As the authorities closed in on Jesus, the disciples ran away. After Peter's attack on the high priest's servant, they feared the worst. The temple guards could have taken them into custody and charged them before the Romans. Despite their allegiance to Jesus, they deserted him when their freedom was jeopardized. Jesus offered no resistance as they took him to the house of the high priest. This place included extensive rooms and a huge courtyard around which was a protective wall. Caiaphas was the high priest that year, and his father Annas had been high priest during the time of John the Baptist. We don't know Peter's motivation in following Jesus to this place. It could have been a fear or a timid attempt to keep his word, to follow him. Matthew tells us simply that Peter wanted to see the outcome of these events. Nevertheless, we soon see that Peter's courageous commitment to follow Jesus to the end turned out to be an empty claim. As the authorities led Jesus away, Peter followed at a distance. He must have hidden in the trees of the garden until the group passed down the pathway toward Jerusalem. The fact that Peter remained at a distance far away is understandable, since he was the one who assaulted the high priest's servant with the sword and cut his ear off. It also conveys an aspect of Peter's character. He was willing to follow Jesus, but not so close as to endanger himself. Unfortunately, that description applies to many of us today. Yes, we might say we follow Jesus, but when push comes to shove, a lot of times we reject Jesus and we go into the background, just as Peter did. The night must have been cold, because some of them built a fire in the middle of the courtyard. The word some refers to the main body of the temple guards and the servants who brought Jesus to the high priest. Most homes of the wealthy and the powerful had courtyards next to their structures or their mansions. Surrounded by a wall, the entrance was you came into the courtyard through a large door that was tended by servants. Since the group with Jesus had already entered, Peter needed help getting past the doorkeeper. Another disciple, and most authorities think it was John because they were so close, was known to the high priest. And so he came in, and when he saw Peter standing there, he spoke to the slave who kept the door, and she allowed Peter also to go into the courtyard. Now, when the doorkeeper saw Peter, she challenged him, "Aren't you one of the disciples?" Taken aback, Peter denied her claim. He went into the courtyard where the temple guards and servants had made a fire. He had fled from the Garden of Gethsemane after he cut the ear off. But he joined them now, alternating between standing with the guards and sitting by the fire. The authorities and perhaps 2 or 3 guards took Jesus further into the complex to meet Annas and then Caiaphas. The other members of the mob sat down together around the fire. They must not have noticed Peter as he sat down among them. Likely, the group also included other servants from the household. At first, being with the crowd really helped Peter because he could be avoided and not recognized. There were so many there. Okay, let's go on to our next 2 verses, verses 56 and 57. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. As long as Peter lingered in the darkness, he was somewhat safe. But seated there in the firelight, he was exposed to the scrutiny of others. A servant girl saw him. She was the same servant who served as doorkeeper and let Peter inside at the request of John. As Peter entered, he may have been hidden by his cloak and the darkness. As he sat near the firelight, she looked very closely at him. Peter must have become nervous as she said, "This man was with him." She addressed her comments to the people around the fire, referring to Peter as "this man." Peter denied it. He may have pulled his garments more closely around his head and turned away from her. Now, denied is a fairly mild word. So Peter followed up by saying, "Woman, I don't know him." Now, it was Peter who first confessed Jesus as the Messiah, But when identified as one of Jesus' followers, he claimed to never have known him. This is an absolute denial as he disputed her claim. Again, this was one of Peter's darkest moments and would haunt him the rest of his days. Perhaps Peter gave in to fear. Perhaps in the wake of these events, he began to doubt all the Lord that had told him. Jesus' followers really hoped that Jesus would be the one to redeem Israel. Now the prospects of this promise seemed as dim as the dark night sky. With Jesus' imminent death approaching, it seemed that the faith and courage of Peter was dying also. Now, the word denied only appears in verse 57. After this, Luke simply recorded what Peter said at each attempt. Notice Peter's progression so far. At first, he followed Jesus and the authorities, but he stayed at a distance. Then he came into the courtyard only after John vouched for him. Next, he mingled quietly with the crowd around the fire before he sat down with them. Finally, Peter tried to distance himself from Jesus by denying he knew him. When we choose not to commit ourselves to totally following Jesus, regardless of the cost, we end up paying a much dearer price. Okay, let's look at verses 58 through the first part of 60. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly, this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." The phrase "a little later" tells us that Peter got by with his deception for only a short time. However, attention had been drawn to him. Perhaps as he sat fidgeting by the fire, the others in the group began whispering about what the maid had said about him. Peter moved away from the fire and onto the porch. Still, someone else saw him. This doesn't mean the others around the fire did not see Peter, but someone else recognized him on the porch. The new accuser said, "You're one of them." The female servant had spoken to the group and referred to Peter as "this man." This challenger addressed Peter directly. Now, this implies that the crowd was well aware of Jesus' disciples. They knew them because the disciples had been everywhere with Jesus and his ministry. As the old saying goes, you're known by the company you keep. Once again, Peter claimed he was not one of Jesus' beloved followers. In this moment, he did not want to be known as part of Jesus' disciples. Peter's reply denied not only his association with Jesus, but also his association with the other disciples. He was now in full self-preservation mode. He abandoned his Lord, and he betrayed his closest friends, the disciples. Peter must have been very fearful at this point. Luke may not have considered the contrast between Peter's response, "I am not," and Jesus' oft-repeated phrase, "I am." Still, we must recognize that Jesus was always confident with his identity. At this moment, Peter wanted to be anything other than who he was. Peter accompanied his denial with an oath that he was not the man they thought him to be. More time passed. During Peter's crisis in the courtyard, Jesus was being questioned by Annas and ridiculed by the others. Peter had not been struck in the face like Jesus was. He had not suffered at the hands of his enemies, but he was afraid of what might happen to him if the guards believed he was one of Jesus' followers. Peter got by with his denials for a little while, but about an hour later, he faced another who incriminated him more fervently. The man asserted, "This means that the man repeatedly challenged Peter." Even though we don't have that repetition in the scripture, the word means that they did that over, or the man did over and over again. The accuser was not put off by Peter's previous denials. Certainly, this fellow was with him, the man said. As proof, the man noted that Peter was also a Galilean. Peter's accent revealed his homeland, just as people from the South, New York, or other places in our country can be identified by their manner of speech. I know we have traveled a lot in our younger days, and it always amazed me when I went north up to New York and heard them talk, and then I went to the far south and heard them, how different they were from us. So this man recognized that Peter was a Galilean. He was different. His talk, his manners were different. Even his clothing was different. It is doubtful that Peter had been conversing with the people around the fire. Of course, he didn't say anything, but they heard his previous responses to the servant girl and to the men that accused him. At this point, whether he knew it or not, Peter's danger level soared because his accuser was a relative of the servant whose ear Peter had cut off in the garden. Peter declared he didn't know what the man was talking about. Peter cursed and he swore as he responded. Perhaps he thought these people would not imagine that someone who followed Jesus would speak this way. More likely, he was so frightened that he went back to his language as a fisherman. Can you imagine the weight of grief that was building in Peter's heart? How could he deny Jesus? He had followed Jesus for 3 years. Now, being intimidated, he walked away in shame. Okay, let's look at the rest of 60 and 61. Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. Timing is important. A rooster crowed after Peter denied Jesus for the 3rd time. This took place immediately. If it had happened half an hour later, Peter might have not made the connection between the rooster and the denial. The fact that it occurred just as he was speaking left no doubt as to what was happening. In verse 61, then means that at the moment of the rooster's crowing, Jesus must have been brought out of the high priest's residence and was standing across the courtyard from Peter. Some people think that he was still in the inner court because most of these big mansions had 2 courtyards, the outer court and the inner court. Now, Jesus was in the inner court, and of course, Peter was in the outer court. If so, and Jesus was still in the inner court, he was able to look through a doorway and see Peter outside. As the sound of the rooster was heard in the early morning hour, the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Jesus' act of turning shows he was engaged with the authorities and guards. He knew what was happening with Peter, so he physically turned toward him. Through more than a glance, Jesus' look was not a glare. It was not a scowl. His eyes likely conveyed much, much sadness. As Peter made eye contact with Jesus, he remembered the word the Lord had spoken. What had taken place only a few hours earlier had been forgotten. Peter was traumatized by the events of the arrest in the garden, at his shadowing of the mob, and the frightening accusations by the people around the fire. As Peter saw the Lord looking at him, the same came flooding back to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. Jesus' prediction took place around 3:00 a.m. Commentators often make a point about the difference between Judas's betrayal and Peter's denial. Judas had an evil intent prompted by greed, seeking to gain from Jesus' arrest. On the other hand, the fact that Peter followed Jesus into the residence of the high priest speaks to his good intentions. He failed in these moments of testing due to fear, not wickedness. Had Peter been faithful in prayer during the garden watch, he may have been stronger during this hour of temptation. Looking back as distant observer, we might wonder why Peter did not have some sense of the situation after he responded to the first accuser. We wonder whether Peter would have failed if he had looked to Jesus instead of waiting for Jesus to look at him. If we had been in his shoes, we might, having experienced the shock of Jesus' arrest, have not acted any differently. Who knows? As it was, only after the third denial did the crowing rooster and the master looking at him, did it bring all this back to Peter, and he remembered. Okay, let's look now at verse 62, excuse me. And he went outside and wept bitterly. As the realization of his failure flooded over Peter, he broke away from Jesus' gaze and fled from the courtyard. Technically, in the courtyard, he was already outside the building. The phrase "he went outside" means he left the compound completely. As he went, he wept bitterly. The term describes someone so overwhelmed he could not contain his emotions. Going out the door, Peter must have passed by the same female doorkeeper who challenged him and led him to his first denial. Remorse filled his heart, but no amount of tears could undo what he had done. His professed courage and loyalty had disappeared. Boldly, he had declared he would go to prison or die for Jesus. The other disciples made the same pledge, but they ran away. At least Peter had come this far, yet nothing mattered but his guilty heart. We should consider the costly nature of discipleship before being put into situations where we are challenged by unbelievers. By maintaining a constant communion with Christ and depending on the empowerment of his Spirit, we can remain faithful whenever tests come our way. We may have moments when we try to hide our Christian identity in an effort to blend into the world. But God calls his children to be a light in the dark world. What good is a light if it is covered for no one to see? There will be situations where our fidelity to Christ will falter. But thanks be to God, our identity is not ultimately grounded in what we do, but in what Christ has done. Like Peter, we may find ourselves behaving in ways that are shameful. Yet God's grace is free to all who believe, and his mercies are new every morning. The failure of Peter, along with the testimony of Acts, reassures us that God's grace is greater than our failures. Jesus is faithful even when his followers fail in their faithfulness. This was not only good news for Peter, but this is good news for all of us. Peter's failure and his restoration through repentance and grace reminds us that the victorious Christian life isn't a sinless life, because we will sin daily, but it's a repentant life. And so Peter was able to come back and be restored by Christ and forgiven, even though he may not have forgiven himself for denying Jesus, but Jesus forgave him. Thank you for being with us today, and I hope you enjoyed our lesson.